I'd like to talk to you about how trauma affects the brain and put it in the context of the work that you're going to be doing as leaders. I like to use something called Dan Siegel's brain in the palm of your hand. So what I'm going to do is show you your brain from the perspective of this being a model. Your thumb represents what we call your midbrain, limbic, or even base of the brain regions, including your palm. And your fingers represent what's called your cortex. And this is really important because in human beings, this is extremely advanced. And these two little fingernails here, they're called your prefrontal cortex. And this is so important because if we're not under threat, if we haven't experienced trauma, the prefrontal cortex has such a wide range of impact on our behavior and our thoughts and our emotions. It's what gets so heavily involved when we're thinking about how do we want to respond to a situation? Where do I want to go for lunch today? Trauma is mainly a subcortical experience. So when you're working with survivors, when you're working with victims, wherever they are along that spectrum, it's really important to understand that when they're being affected by the trauma, this prefrontal cortex is very rarely involved in their reactions and in their ability to make sense of their environment and what's going on around them. So it doesn't shut down, and this is really important to understand. People still have thoughts, and they can still organize their thoughts, and they can still make decisions. It's just that those decisions are very often compromised because of the experience of trauma. So one of the things that we can do to help you understand this experience of subcortical versus cortical is to share an experiment with you. So one of these experiments is to put you in a maze, and we can even put VR goggles on you, right? So your brain thinks that you're in this maze. And what we tell you to do is go around through the maze and try to find this beast. And your job is, when you find the beast, to use the little dart gun that we've got so you can put the beast to sleep, right? And so while people are doing this, while you're doing this, your prefrontal cortex is lighting up like a Christmas tree because you're looking for clues and you're trying to remember, have I been to this direction? Should I go in that direction? And then if what we tell you is the scenario has changed, you've found the beast, but you've lost your dart gun. Get out of the maze. You're going to frantically try to retrace your steps. And in doing so, what we notice is this prefrontal cortex, this region of the brain, powers down. Again, it doesn't become impaired, but it powers down, and these limbic, subcortical, and by subcortical, what we mean is below the cortex, they light up like a Christmas tree. And from this perspective, we see a difference in responding, which I think about from the perspective of I'm thinking about the best way to respond, to reaction, which is I've just got to do something right now. Survivors and victims, for the most part, they're living their lives from a reactive place. So let's talk about how that comes about. When somebody experiences abuse, it's critical to understand that that abuse conditions the brain. So if you remember, there have been experiments done where you can ring a bell and feed a dog, and when you feed the dog will start to salivate. And eventually, over time, you ring the bell, don't feed the dog, and the dog still salivates. Now, that's called conditioning. The problem is, in cases of domestic violence, you can use a facial expression, a tone of voice, a posture. There can be a surrounding circumstance that's present. And then if I act abusively, your brain gets conditioned so that moving forward, if your brain sees any of those certain circumstances that matches up with the abuse, your brain assumes that you're about to be abused in the same way that the dog assumed that it was about to be fed. And in assuming that the dog was about to be fed, the dog salivated. Unfortunately for human beings, when human beings assume that they're about to be abused. And the word assume is almost a little bit dangerous to use because it's not conscious. This is all subcortical. But when the brain draws the conclusion, this is going to end up in abuse, we are then at the mercy of our circuitry-driven reactions, which are about this notion of how the brain works in survival circumstances from years and years and years of needing to just survive on the planet. And it also then relies on all the ways that you've been taught to stay alive over the course of your own lifetime. So in these moments of being abused, you will see folks who will do what's called dissociating. And dissociation is this subcortical reaction that the brain has to basically disconnect us from our bodies so that we can survive the abuse, so that we can just get from A to B. And if you interview victims and survivors, you probably have heard them folks talk about this notion of, I just wanted the abuse to be over. I just wanted it to end. Dissociation aids us in that notion of, let me just get to the end. It's also important to understand that some of these reactions that we have can be conditioned over time so that we become extremely subservient. We become extremely quiet. We try to disappear. We become so conditioned to reacting that we don't even have to think about the way we react. We just react. So, how does that relate then to the work that you do in the group? Well, one, it's really important to understand that in group, you're going to see little signs of folks shutting down, of folks becoming agreeable, of folks not feeling comfortable speaking their mind because their brain has been conditioned that if I speak out, if my voice is heard, what happens? I suffer abuse. So in time, you're going to see this in your groups. And what we don't want to do as leaders is we don't want to be the source of that shutting down. In other words, we don't want to in any way, shape, or form be part of the environment that can create this notion of the brain believing that abuse is about to happen. Now, as a leader, this is probably a little bit crazy to hear. Like, how could I ever be one of the people that triggers this? And so I want to help you understand how that can happen. Okay, so if we go to this other part of the brain called your motor cortex. Your motor cortex is where anytime you move, this part of your brain fires. We've known now for many years that you have cells here in this motor cortex that fire not when you move, but when you see other people move in ways that you're familiar. So if you're watching a basketball game and you play basketball, you've played basketball in the past, maybe not for 20 years. When you watch that basketball game, your brain will fire like you're shooting a basketball, like you're running down the court. Isn't that amazing? The science behind this is remarkable to me. Here's where it relates to your job. What is a facial expression? A facial expression is a movement of muscles. And we know from research that human beings are familiar with all of the facial expressions that we can possibly make. So what that means is we have to be really sensitive to our own facial expressions and our own presence in the group. I like to draw a distinction between soft eyes and hard eyes. Most of the survivors that you work with will have experienced hard eyes from the abuser. And they will have experienced hard eyes not just when they're being abused, but when the abuser is engaging in controlling behavior, for example. It's not outright abusive, but it's that behavior that says, if you don't, then the abuse will come. So hard eyes, which we're going to associate with this environment of abuse, is also, for some of us, just the look that we engage in when we concentrate. I'm not angry. I'm not abusive. I'm just really interested. I'm concentrating. Or we do get frustrated, or we're tired, or we're hungry. We've been worn down. It's a long day. Your group doesn't start till 7 o'clock, and you get a call right before group starts that your kid borrowed the car without asking, or you've had a dispute with your spouse, or something in your life has gone wrong. It's very easy to walk into group and have that disruption, have that upset on your face. And I want you to know that subcortically, the members of your group will pick up on that. They will read that, and it will be incredibly disturbing to them in the gut and in the chest. Because, and here's the huge golden nugget for you, The takeaway of trauma is this system that allows us to even detect threat, this system that allows us to pick up on the subtle signs that there's threat in the environment. It becomes hypersensitive when we've experienced trauma. So the individuals in your group are going to become hypersensitive to your facial expression, as well as your tone, your posture, just your presence. So if we walk into the room with that upset, with that frustration, or if something happens in the group and we notice that we're starting to experience frustration, agitation, we have to have ways to calm ourselves and get into what I call soft eyes. Soft eyes says loud and clear to people, I honor your experience. I appreciate your humanity. I appreciate your presence in the room. Even if you're doing something that's incredibly annoying to me, I'm still going to have soft eyes. If we're on the third group in a row where you're continuing to assert that the other folks in the group don't get it, that your partner really isn't that abusive, and you think to yourself, oh my goodness, how is this person not get soft eyes? I honor your experience. I honor your humanity. Another skill that I want you to think about is called being an informational thinker. Because one of the things that happens when folks react to trauma, so somebody in group is getting triggered and they're acting out, we have a tendency as human beings to attribute a reason for that. And so we'll say something like in our own minds, gosh, I can't believe this person's acting this way. I've told them that they either need to ask for permission to, go to the bathroom, or that, you may have certain group rules that people are violating, or you may have somebody who's started to act out in group from the perspective of starting to be rude to other group members. And it's easy to say to ourselves, why are you acting this way? Being an informational thinker reframes that and genuinely says, no, really, I'm curious why. What's going on underneath the surface? And see, when we get curious, it's really easy to have soft eyes. If we're saying why from a perspective of really what we want to say is, I want this to stop, then it's very easy to have hard eyes. So when we combine soft eyes with informational thinking, it allows us to, in the way that we can, influence the environment of the group, to experience this notion of acceptance, experience this notion of, I honor your experience, I honor your humanity. And what I'm sure you are already well aware of is that that is diametrically opposed to the experience of abuse. So if the brain is trying to pick up on subtle signs or indicators that abuse is about to happen, having soft eyes and being an informational thinker go a long way towards influencing the group to experience the group as what we call a safe place. Your brain, believe it or not, your brain is always mapping the environment. Always. It maps it physically. For example, in your own home, if the lights go out, you are likely able to find your way around because your brain has mapped that space. Well, the brain is also always mapping the environment from the perspective of safety and threat. Is this environment consistent with safety? Is this environment consistent with threat? So, if you think about this from the perspective of trauma, what happens is, over time, we become heightened in our awareness of, is this environment consistent with map of safety, map of threat? Map of safety, map of threat. So you as the leader, you're able to influence the individuals in your group at a subcortical level with your tone, with your presence, with your facial expression, because by having soft eyes and being informational, you map to safety. What maps to threat, for example, is starting to wonder, why did someone behave this way? Because think about controlling behavior. Think about when a victim comes home, all of the why questions. Why did you do this? Why did you do that? This notion of getting the third degree, this notion of being questioned. So that maps to threat. It's so much more helpful then for us if we are going to ask questions to make sure that when we're asking people questions, we have soft eyes and we're coming from a place of being truly informational, genuinely curious, as opposed to wanting an answer. Some other things that help us map to safety, and these are very specific things that you can do in your group as a leader. You can identify choices that people can have. So, for example, when somebody new comes into your group, asking them, "What would you like me to call you?" That gives somebody a choice. And it may seem like such a small, minuscule, but it maps you to safety. Another thing that I think is really important in terms of a skill as a leader is to be transparent. Because again, if you think about the experience of being abused, when we enter relationships, I have not, and so, just a little bit, I ran groups with abusive men for 10 years. I've worked with survivors and victims for that long, both in the context of visiting groups as well as I worked in a women's prison for 7 years. And guess what? The vast majority of them experienced domestic violence. Do you know what I've not yet heard? A case where an individual went on a first date and the abuser said, "I'm abusive." And so what happens is you start to experience somebody as kind, you experience somebody as loving, and over time, you recognize the person that you've mapped to safety, they are now behaving in ways that are consistent with threat. And that lack of transparency is extremely disturbing. As a group leader, it's crucial that we be as transparent as possible, that we explain why we're doing what we're doing, that we talk about the rationale for decisions that we've made, whether they have to do with breaks, whether they have to do with content for that day, whether they have to do with anything that goes on in the group that you can talk about and be transparent about, that maps you to safety and not to threat. Let's move on and talk a little bit about when somebody in your group actually becomes triggered. We start by, we map the environment. We notice that something in this environment is consistent with threat. And this is all subcortical. This has nothing to do with our conscious awareness. So we map an environment to safety or threat. If we map an environment to threat, we become more aware of that environment, again, subcortically. So we become aware, and that's called vigilance. And you may have heard the term hypervigilance. Hypervigilance is when we become heightened in our awareness of the sights and the sounds and the smells and the bodily felt experiences and the behaviors of others. We then have a region of our brain. It's called your amygdala. It will signal danger. It will signal threat. That amygdala becomes hypersensitive. We don't just become hypervigilant. Very often folks stop at hypervigilance when they describe the impact of trauma, and they forget to talk about not only are you aware of all the sights and the sounds and the smells and the bodily felt experiences and the behavior of others, but now your amygdala is more likely to signal danger when danger doesn't actually exist. What does exist is something in the environment that your brain associates with threat in your past. So whether it's a tone of voice, whether it's a movement in the group, whether it's some content in the group, because as hard as we try to not trigger our clients still become triggered because we're talking about abuse and we're talking about dynamics and we're talking about healthy relationships. And so you may ask yourself, well, how can talking about a healthy relationship trigger the amygdala? Because if I sit in the group and I start to think about healthy relationships, doesn't it make sense that I might start to think about, oh my gosh, I've never had a healthy relationship? And then when I think about the unhealthy relationships, I start to think about the ways that those relationships have been unhealthy. And now I'm being led right back down the path of remembering some of the ways that I've been abused, some of the ways I've been controlled. And here's the part that's so crucial to remember. The amygdala has no connection with what's out in the world or what's in your mind. So if you think about something scary, your amygdala gets triggered. Think about this. Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night from a nightmare? If you have experienced the amygdala being triggered just by something that's going on in your head. It has nothing to do with what's in the world. It has to do with your experience in your mind, and that can trigger the amygdala. So it's really important for us to understand that this notion of getting triggered is something that is going to happen in the group. And if you notice that somebody's becoming triggered, very often the last thing that we want to do is call out that somebody in the group has become triggered. So what I often will encourage folks to do is use the opportunity of somebody being triggered to work with the entire group. One of the mistakes that I think we make as leaders is that we forget that we're working with a group as opposed to individuals. So when somebody has a need in the group, you don't always have to work with that person individually. You can work with the group. And so what I'd like to share with you are called grounding exercises. But before I do that, I want to tell you a little bit about why they work. This is really amazing science. When the amygdala is signaling danger, 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 the prefrontal cortex starts to power down. One of the things we can do as a leader is we can say to the group, ask the group to notice something in the environment. Now, why is that relevant, noticing? It's because when we notice something, it activates this region of the brain in the prefrontal cortex, get this, that literally soothes the limbic system, the amygdala. And there's been research on this where they have given people threatening stimulus, something that gets the amygdala, and then they ask them to notice something in the environment. And when they take pictures of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, and in particular, it's called the left prefrontal cortex, seems to light up and the amygdala seems to dampen. And if you've ever done a grounding exercise, you've probably experienced this. I just want you to know that there's science to support that. What I always like to say is, being trauma-informed means we assume everybody has a trauma history, and when you use a grounding exercise, you're never going to do harm. So there's really not going to be any downside of doing a grounding exercise. And so it would look like this. Instead of pointing out that you notice somebody in the group has been triggered, you simply say to the group, hey, I want to teach you something called grounding. And if you've already taught them, say, hey, I wonder if it would be helpful for us to practice a grounding exercise. Let's all just see if we can feel our feet in our shoes right now. And as they feel their feet in their shoes, ask them to notice when they've struggled to notice their feet. Because what you want to help folks understand is that when the brain starts to lose focus, it very often tends to go right back to the trigger. So as we refocus and refocus back on your feet, notice when your brain has started to move away from your feet and just come back to your feet. What this does is it soothes the amygdala. Now, another common way of doing grounding is ask people to notice the breath. And when I was working in the women's prison, I had a very interesting experience. I had one of my clients say to me, I don't feel comfortable just noticing my breath because it feels like it disconnects me from my connection to God. And she explained that she was Christian and that this was really a struggle for her. She just wasn't sure how was she going to negotiate this exercise that sounded like it would be helpful, but felt like it was disconnecting from her spiritual self, which to her was really important. She came back the next week and said, I figured it out. And she said, I have decided that when I breathe in and notice my breath, I'm going to say in with his love. And when I breathe out, I'm going to say out with his compassion. And in that way, I stay connected to God. And when my mind wanders, I can say, oh, back to his love. When we practice this grounding exercise, this notion of noticing, whether it's the breath, whether it's the connection to your spiritual self, to God, it soothes the amygdala. And this is an absolutely crucial skill for you to have in your toolbox, so to speak, as a leader. Because my guess is if you've done this work for any time, or even if you've been a member of a group, you've noticed that folks have become triggered in the group. We just talked about grounding, and I mentioned the notion of having a toolbox, and I want to use that way of summarizing what we talked about so far, because really the point of all of this is to try to give you a little bit of information about the brain, but more importantly, to connect that to what's in your toolbox. So if you remember, we talked about the notion that trauma is a subcortical experience. And one of the first things we talked about was that when folks are in the room with you, it's crucial that you have what we call soft eyes. And so soft eyes is a really important tool in the toolbox. And I just want to remind you, although it can be difficult for us to acknowledge that we may not have soft eyes all the time, it's absolutely crucial. All of us as human beings, by the nature of being human, we fall into having hard eyes. And so it's just really important to be aware of your presence in the room. So that's the first tool. The second tool is this notion of giving people choice, and that relates to wanting folks to map you to safety from this perspective of map of safety, map of threat, and choice maps you to safety because the abuser likely has not given choice. The experience of being a victim of domestic violence is about having choice removed. And then that third tool in the toolbox was the notion of being transparent. So being willing to talk about why you're doing what you're doing, why you've said what you've said, or for example, why do you have particular rules that you have in the group? And then also really letting folks know that it's okay to ask questions about why this or why that. So that notion of transparency will also map you to safety. Finally, that last tool is that notion of grounding, based in the science that people are going to get triggered in your group because trauma is subcortical. That amygdala is hypersensitive, and when it signals danger, Will Robinson, people don't get to choose how they react.